Before we start this week's podcast, I'd like to say a quick thank you to our podcast sponsor, PensionBee. Now, PensionBee is one of the UK's leading online pension providers that helps consumers combine, contribute and withdraw from their pensions, all through the PensionBee web and mobile app. Now, you can sign up with the names of your old employers or providers in just 5 minutes, and PensionBee will help you find, transfer and combine your old forgotten about pension pots into a low-cost online pension plan. Now, these are managed by the likes of BlackRock, State Street Global Advisors, Legal & General or HSBC. Now, they have over 250,000 customers that have already signed up to combine their pensions with PensionBee, combining close to £1 billion into their plans. You can also find out more information about PensionBee at pensionbee.com, and as always with investments, your capital is at risk.
Hello and welcome to episode 258 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, how you doing?
I'm good. It's been a hectic week, hasn't it, Andy? But a good week, and I say hectic because it's been in relation to various things we're doing, but particularly in terms of press stuff. So we don't always talk about it, but we do stuff with the national press during the week. So it would be a journalist will come along and ask me for a quote on obviously a wide range of topics. You hear the topics we talk about on the podcast or we write about, from investing to various different things. And we had a number of those in the last week, including the Times, the Sun, the Financial Times, so a wide range. But there's one in particular that was a standout one for us, wasn't it, that I wanted to mention that was very particularly pleasing, was the one that was in the Sun. It's an unusual one really for us, the Sun newspaper in their money section, but they did a whole piece on our money MOT. And now the money MOT is about 10 months old, and there's been about 13,000 MOTs run, which is an incredible number. And it just came about that we ended up doing a piece with them, and they asked us to send in some quotes and bits and pieces and pictures. So go and have a look at it. You can find it on our social channels or by Googling the article. But it was a brilliant piece, so I was appreciative of that. And it's really good to get a piece in the national press where it is just a focal point being something we've done, rather than me giving commentary or opinion on something else that's going on in the world of personal finance. So that was brilliant. And the other thing I just want to mention, we got some acknowledgement on the podcast as well, didn't we? We got listed in the Best Money podcasts in a piece by Good Housekeeping, which is also nice. It was, if you recall, I did a panel event for them probably about 6 months ago or something like that. And they just coincidentally ran a piece on money podcasts and we featured in it. So it has inspired us this week, letting the cat out of the bag a bit earlier, for one of our own pieces about money podcast. So that will, I'll come on to that. So
we're going to highlight others as well. And because it almost came from me telling Damien how much I love podcasts, how much I listen to podcasts. In fact, I looked at the stats the other day and Damien nearly fell off his chair when he realised that I can't remember in what time period it was, but I've listened to over 800 hours worth of podcasts. So,
and that's not our podcast, because obviously don't forget that Andy does the podcast, edits the podcast, so he listens to way more than that, because that obviously is our podcast. But Andy has got this, it's become a phrase in our office that we laugh at. Lauren pointed out that Andy often starts a sentence with, I was listening to a podcast the other day about that, and Andy listens to so many podcasts that he's an aficionado of these things, aren't you? So you have taken over a section today about the Best Money podcast. So I'll get that out there straight away then. Andy's going to do a section on the podcast this week about the Best Money podcast, not us, other ones that are out there. And I know a lot of you, well, not a lot of you, I know some of you will listen to other money podcasts as well as ours. So I thought it was only right that Andy has gone through a range of money podcasts and picked out some of his best ones that he likes and ones for you to listen to, because I admit I don't get a chance to listen to as many podcasts on any genre, and even money, as much as I should do or would like to.
No, but what you do a lot of reading, and you've read lots of finance books and money books, and we've promised before, and we should get round to doing that in sometime in the future, where we review the money books. And in fact, in our community group, we've had a whole post and stream of comments about books and finance and things like that.
Yeah, so
don't give yourself a hard time.
I'm not going to give myself too much. I can't do everything. So that's going to be the first piece. I'll go straight on to what the rest of the podcast is going to be about. The other two sections are going to be one on debt, so cancelling unused credit cards and the impact on credit scores. So that is a popular topic. I often get asked it when I go to events. I got asked it at the last event that we did about the impact, what people should do, should they cancel unused credit cards, etc. So I'm going to go through the pros and cons, kind of do's and don'ts on that topic. And the other one on an investing theme is the value for money assessments. Now, this might be news to many of you, but fund managers are having to produce value for money assessments of their funds that they run. And I'm going to explain what they are and how you might find some use in them and some other things to look out for from my own experience. Oh, and another quick piece we're going to do, a bit of listener feedback on Avios points. We did a piece, I think 2 podcasts ago, about Avios points that got a lot of good feedback about how you can boost your Avios points and sort of tricks and hacks. And one of our listeners got in touch and there's some of their own, which are brilliant ones they shared via Instagram. So I want to do a quick piece on that, and I'll mention the person. It's Lucy, if you listen to it. So it's worth listening to. It'll probably come at the end of the pod.
Great. So what are we going to kick off with?
The investment part of the podcast I'm going to do on these value for money assessments. Now, there are lots of things that happen in the world of regulation in finance and the world of fund management, and one of the new requirements from the FCA, so that's the Financial Conduct Authority, the regulator of the financial services sector out there, they have now placed the onus on fund management houses to show the value of the funds that they manage, what they do, rather than the onus always being on us as investors to try and work out, are the funds that they're producing or they run any good? Do they represent value for money? And so to do that, they require now fund managers to start to produce value for money assessments. And the assessments have to be produced within 4 months of a fund's reporting period. So if you have a fund, they all have different reporting periods. It's almost like, if you think of it from a business perspective, it's like your business year end. There's a period after which they will have to, therefore 4 months, they will have to produce these assessments. And that means there's different timetables for different funds and different fund houses, which isn't particularly helpful.
No, it's not very standardised, is it?
It's not standardised. It's the whole point of this exercise is it's not actually that prescriptive, but it's not actually prescriptive from the FCA what these assessments are meant to include. But what has happened is the first of them has started to appear. So at the end of last year, and now we're going into 2020, we got to the point where fund houses were having to start to produce these, looking at their own funds. And as I mentioned about the 4-month period after the fund's reporting period, that is starting to be triggered for lots of different fund houses. So we're starting to see some of the fund houses produce these reports. And as a positive, the first few have actually produced separate reports, not just tagged them on as a part of maybe their annual reports for the fund house in its entirety.
Kind of bury it in the small print, yeah.
Yeah, but what this has, the implication for this is quite significant, particularly for the active fund part of the industry. So when we talk about active funds, we're talking about the funds that are run by managers rather than computers, the ones that aren't just tracking an index. And so the FCA came up with a set of criteria, areas that these assessments had to cover. So I'm going to go through these quickly. The FCA expects value statements to include some analysis of the quality of service, so the range of and quality of services provided by the fund houses to the what they call unit holders, the people who hold their funds. They have to look at performance, and that's the performance sort of minus all payments and charges, etc., over different time frames. And they say the performance should be considered over an appropriate timescale with regard to the investment's objectives, policy and strategy. So what you're looking at there, what they're really talking about is the aims of the fund, but also the benchmarks, because don't forget funds have benchmarks. We've got to look at costs, that's the other part. So that's actually the cost of providing the service and any charges that relate to. And of course the economies of scale is another part, which is the sort of savings and benefits from having economies of scale and pooling everybody's money together. They wanted them to also compare market rates in relation to services, comparable services and funds. They wanted to look at different classes of units. So this was really down to the point of funds have different share classes. And I get asked this a lot on 80/20 Investor and generally about people look on a fund platform and they can find a different share class for the same fund, and they're trying to understand what the differences are. Well, of course, some funds have share classes that are very expensive. They're more expensive than the cleaner share classes that exist. There may be legacy fund share classes that are expensive, that can pay commission to financial advisors that no longer need to be paid. So people are stuck in those. They're just not. They can move, but no one's telling them to do so. The fund management houses aren't. So the FCA was trying to get the fund houses to reflect on all of this and therefore have to provide a value assessment of their funds. Now, I like this. I think it's a good initiative. The only downside is, like a lot of stuff, it's very subjective. It's the fund houses making these assessments of their own products and services. But what we've had a couple of fund houses starting to issue these. So one of them is Rathbones, and they've been held up as being a bit of a leading light in this and hoping everybody else follows suit. So they actually said that two of their funds, it was a Rathbone UK Opportunities Fund and their Global Alpha Fund, they highlighted the underperformance of those funds, so they had to come clean, as it were. And that's what people are hoping now, that we're going to start getting these value assessments are going to start shining a light, because you can't hide them. A bit of transparency,
a little bit of communication between them and the people who own these units.
Yeah, and that's exactly it, the transparency. And as a result of their report, Rathbones has actually moved about 2,000 people into cheaper versions of the funds that they hold, so cheaper versions of Rathbones funds. So that's a positive. So you can see there are already signs that fund houses now are having to flag warnings almost about their own funds to say that this isn't perfect. Now, it isn't just an active versus passive thing, because Vanguard is one of the other fund houses that has done this, and they've actually flagged 4 funds that gave them amber warnings, 4 out of 29, as to have some sort of to be watched. They're not going to do anything about them as yet, because they say the performance hasn't had a long enough track record of 5 years, but they are keeping a watching eye. Now, 2 of them, the Vanguard Global Equity Fund, and they've got an equivalent Global Equity Income Funds. They're active funds, actually, interestingly enough. So Vanguard does do active funds, and they've lagged their benchmarks over 1 and 3 year periods. So Vanguard have highlighted this in their report, and there's a bit of that we're going to keep a watching brief, which is positive. That's what you want, a bit of transparency so people can see it.
And are these reports available for people who are potentially going to buy into these things, or are they only accessible if you're already in them?
No, you can download them, because this is one of the things I went and looked for.
Publicly available documents, right?
Yeah, I started to look at I've been seeing some bits in the news about 1 or 2 of these, and I'm going to come on to one in a moment, which is Hargreaves Lansdown, and it's all well and good, but it always seemed to be aimed. The suggestion was from a lot of the literature when it was first announced these reports were coming along, it would be more towards financial advisors. But as a member of the public, you can download them. I've downloaded them. I've looked at them. You can get Vanguards. You can look at Hargreaves Lansdowns and stuff like that. So you can see these reports, and you can go through how they're trying to determine value. That is one of the things I want people to take away, is by reading these reports, you can try and see what it is that they are classing as deeming to be value. And for investors, that is useful in itself to try and develop your own methodology of deeming what value really is, whether something is offering value. And on the Vanguard one, there were 2 other funds that were highlighted. These were passives passive investments that they put on their amber watch list. So the passive ones are the FTSE Developed Europe ex-UK Index, and also the FTSE UK Equity Income Index. So they have failed to match their benchmarks over a 5-year period. So it's something for you to have a look at. There's a number of newspapers that have started to pull this up. The Times did a piece on it. The Telegraph have done a scathing piece on Hargreaves Lansdown, funnily enough. I'm going to read a little bit from it, because Hargreaves Lansdown has just released their latest version of this. So just to spin out the headline, it's Hargreaves Lansdown claims it offers value for money as 80% of its funds return less than rivals. So that's the title of the piece. You can go and find it if you want. They're quite scathing about it. I mean, the opening line is, under pressure fund shop Hargreaves Lansdown has defended its poor performing funds and high charging range of multi-manager funds, suggesting they offer value for money, a statement met with derision by analysts. Now, you can go and look at the report, how they come to those conclusions. And I mean, it also says in this article about, in Hargreaves' version of their report, it said all 10 of its multi-manager portfolios, where the underlying investments are stocks or bonds, offered value for money. This is despite 8 of them returning less than the average rival over 3 years, and 5 out of the 6 producing below par performance over 5 years. And of course, then the article goes on and talks about, inevitably at the moment with Hargreaves Lansdown, is Neil Woodford. But what it does, these reports are starting to appear out there, and they are starting to force fund managers to shine a light on their own funds. The positive is, if you don't read them, it should start to mean that we get fund houses having to up their game. You're probably going to see some fund closures and mergers and things like that, because obviously they're going to have to get rid of funds that are now underperforming because they can't hide away anymore. This already happened for some people who've released these reports. But the wider thing is, I just think for people looking at funds, what it does, it makes you think more about what are you buying? What is it? Does it live up to what it's meant to? Does it match its benchmark or beat its benchmark? Is its benchmark a valid benchmark? Does the fund manager remit, do they achieve what they're trying to set out to do? So for a DIY investor, a really good thing to do is to look and try and assess value for any fund that you go into, particularly active funds. Now, the way they assess it is, like I said, is slightly subjective because it's not as prescriptive as it could be. But as a closing statement on this section, I would go to somewhere like Morningstar, so morningstar.co.uk. And if you go and look at a fund and you go onto, there's a tab on the left-hand side when you look at it called Risk and Rating, I think is the section. In there, you can find some of the statistics for these funds. I'm talking about the statistics they are calculated. So alpha, beta, and Sharpe. They're 3 really good stats that I always look for on funds. If a fund has a strong alpha score, typically over 3 years, I think they do it on Morningstar, what that shows is is a measure of the extra sort of performance, as it were, what the extra almost value that the fund manager's adding. It's what they're doing. They're alpha. Fund managers are always after alpha. The higher the alpha score, the better. So if you're above, they're normally quite low. They're sort of just above 0 going towards 1. But the higher the alpha score, the more that the manager's adding to this. So they're actually doing something right. Beta is an interesting one. Beta is a measure of really how the movements in the fund relate to its own benchmark. So if you had a beta of 1, then it means if the market goes up and your fund will go up in lockstep. That's if a fund has a beta of 1. So that means that a lot of the movement can be attributed to the movement in the market. You can get negative beta, so it can be like -1, for example. It goes in the opposite direction. But by looking at those measures, you can see if a fund has a high alpha, the fund manager seems to be doing something right over that period. If it's got a beta that is maybe below 1, then you know it's not just moving with the market. And in particular, the Sharpe ratio is one I like, which is Sharpe with an E on the end, SHARPE. And that is a measure that shows the additional return for the additional risk that the fund manager's taking. So if you imagine if I was in a race with like a Formula 1 car or something like that, I might be trying to beat somebody in a race that is going hell for leather, like so if you think of Lewis Hamilton, he's taking risks, but with that risk he's getting the extra speed and a shorter time and a better best lap time. If it was me, I'd be hurtling into the corner at like 180 mile an hour, taking excess risk and then just crashing out on the bend and game over. See, that's the difference in the fund management world. You want the Sharpe ratio to be high as you can be, and again, it normally starts quite low in a sort of less than 1, but it can be a number that goes up and up. The better the Sharpe ratio, they're getting more performance for the risks they're taking. So rather than being crashing out and burning, because the danger is fund managers can chase risk to boost performance. If you're underperforming, they can take riskier and riskier bets and take riskier positions trying to play catch up. And that would show potentially in the Sharpe ratio that they're actually not getting as much return for the extra risk. So that would be me just hurtling into the corner at Silverstone at 180 mile an hour and not braking. And I'd be sitting there claiming that I'm ahead of Lewis Hamilton, as he then just beautifully sails off into the distance and I wrap myself into a tyre wall. So that is it for that section. I think that is a nice summary of value for money. You should be in all things in life, but also investing.
Okay, so cancelling an unused credit card. Can it affect your credit score? And if so, how?
So this one I'm going to break down into headings because it makes it easier to follow. And we've also done a piece we'll link to from this podcast as a result that sort of summarises this section that people can refer to. But if you have an unused credit card balance, there is an impact obviously on your credit report. If you go and look at your credit report, you can do it from a range of services. Credit Karma is just one that I've used and quite like. They're all generally free these days to be able to do it, but you will see a report that shows you all the lines of credit that you have open at this point in time, how much is on the balance that you have outstanding, and the size of your credit limit. Now, the question often arises if people have gained control of their credit and they've paid off some of their bills and they've reduced the amount they have. And don't forget, the other thing is that credit cards like to throw credit at people who are doing well with their managing their credit, and they start upping your credit limit when you don't really want to, and that kind of thing. People can find themselves with a number of credit cards, particularly if they've used 0% free transfer period. So they've tried to limit the amount of interest they're paying on their debt. You can find as they open the next one, they just end up having this whole range of cards. And so people then start thinking, well, I want to start knocking those down and just start cancelling them. I'm not using them, particularly if they're looking towards for a mortgage. So obviously the pros of cancelling an unused credit card, it reduces your risk of being a victim of fraud, is one of them. Because even if you're not using a credit card, you should still monitor them. And I know I talk about money management apps from time to time. Picking one, Emma app is a good one. You can put your credit cards, even your ones you're not using, on there. And you can see, therefore, if there's any transactions that go on, because it amalgamates everything. That's what I like about it. So you have a current account, a credit card, whatever you spend on, it pulls it all together. And it also shows them separately. But it means that if you have a number of credit cards you're not using, you're going to find out immediately when someone uses it, because it will show up in the app when you go into it, or it will send you an alert of some kind. Whereas if you have a credit card, you just chuck in your bedside table maybe, and you're not using it, you won't not realise until it's too late that someone has somehow got hold of the details and are spending money on it.
Yeah, and even if you're doing the Credit Karma thing and keeping your eye on your credit score, that's generally only updated once or twice a month, and so you won't get the daily alerts that you would with the Emma app, which is good.
Yeah, so the other pros obviously of cancelling is that it can improve how lenders might view you, because you're less reliant on credit, and it obviously removes the temptation of being able to just going out and spending. But there are cons to it. So it increases something called your credit utilization, which is your amount of credit you're using compared to the amount you've got available. So that ratio is something that lenders might look at when they're considering whether they're going to lend to you. Generally speaking, it's good to aim, I hear different figures, but it's good to aim for about a 25% ratio. So if you had a 10 grand limit on your credit card, then it's good to have about 25% of that as an amount that you've been using regularly or something like that. So if you can keep that ratio down, so if you had a 10 grand card and you maxed it out, then that doesn't look great, because it looks like you're struggling to cope with the amount of credit that you've got, or deal with your credit. But if you're keeping it sort of down towards that 25% level, then that shows that you're using credit in a healthy way, you're in control of it. And obviously you will then sometimes probably pay it off completely. So do try and keep it within that range. It's not an absolute number. I've heard different numbers varying from like 15 to 30. But what it means is that if you had a number of credit cards perhaps you weren't using, then if you cancelled them all, you could suddenly increase your percentage that you're using of your overall limit. So just be mindful of that. If you got rid of all your credit cards, then it could leave you what they call like a thin credit file, credit report. So you don't have much history of using credit. And the other thing is that most people probably don't realise, and we were talking about this in the office, is it lowers the age of your credit account to the average age. And it was something that it largely passed me by when we were talking about it. Of course, it's best to have credit that has been around for a long period of time. It has a bit more of a positive sway when people are assessing you for credit, because you've been managing it for a long period of time. So if you decide you want to cancel some credit cards, then you're better off cancelling the more recent ones and keeping the older ones open if you are going to do that. So it just means your average age of your credit has been much longer. You've got a greater history of managing debt well with a particular institution. So when's it best to cancel an unused credit card? If the fees are high, the interest is too high, or you've had problem with debt in the past, or you have multiple unused credit cards, like we said, and you're considering applying for a mortgage with that previous caveat. When it's best to keep them is if the only reason you're cancelling them is because the card is not being used and you have a limited number of credit cards and accounts open. And also, as I mentioned about if it's a particularly old credit account, it can have a positive impact on your credit file. And again, as I say, it increases your utilisation of credit if you were to close too many. So if you are thinking about it, the best ways to do it is to contact your credit issuer to tell them and confirm that you are going to cancel. Send confirmation in writing as well. Cancel any associated payments, direct debits, standing orders, and of course if there's any additional account holders, you're going to have to make sure that they're aware that you're cancelling it, because some people have second account holders on the same card. So it might be the account is in one person's name but they have a second card, and then obviously you need to cut up your credit card when you've done it. So hopefully that answers that question, and one of the most popular questions I'm asked, particularly when we do live events. Okay, right, I've done enough talking for this show, so I'm handing over to Andy to talk about podcasts.
Talk about my favourite subject, other than football.
If you were mastermind, Andy, would you go on there and say your favourite subject was podcasts?
I probably would, you know. Yeah.
So I didn't mean to laugh. It was the way he looked at me when he said that. It's almost.
I was weighing it up.
Weighing it up as if, imagine being on Mastermind talking about podcasts. But
I'm sitting in a black chair. I kind of feel like I'm on it now with a microphone in front of me.
What is your favourite genre of podcasts?
Comedy, I'd have to say. That's my go-to, because I find it. I do a lot of cooking at home. I do a lot of sort of travelling on the train, and sometimes travelling is a mundane thing to do. Cooking, when you're doing it on your own, you've got no one to chat to. It just lightens the mood. I love a bit of comedy.
So do you walk around your house with your headphones in?
Giggling, yeah. And my wife hates it. Sometimes in bed. We'll say goodnight, the light will go off and I've still got a headphone in one ear, just sort of discreetly listening to a podcast, and suddenly I'll start sort of laughing.
You're like a modern day version of the R. White's Lemonade advert from the years when you're a secret podcast listener.
Oh, we've lost the younger listeners now.
But there's loads of people thinking, I remember that advert. Yeah. So before we move on, do you listen to those podcasts as somebody who is on one and edits one? Do you sit there and, be honest, are you critical about the quality of the sound and things like that?
I do have a little bit of a critical side to it, and I am a bit snobby about some of them. But hey, listen, I use it to try and improve my editing skills as well. So I do, yeah.
I set Andy up there because I know how obsessive Andy is about audio and things like that, which is why the podcast does sound as good as it does. Given the equipment that we use, people think you have to have this huge studio and fancy stuff. That's why if you look at our Instagram and Facebook, you'll see us in the office doing the podcast.
We just sit on a desk with a very small mic. We have, like you say, we haven't spent thousands on a studio, so we are limited by that in some sense. But with free software, audio software, you can do some amazing things.
We had thought about widening the equipment we use, and it just doesn't seem to make sense. So anyway, Andy, I've distracted you now. Go on to your... I kind of forced you to listen to Money Podcast, although you do listen to the odd one. So take it away. Who else should we be listening to?
So I probably listen to about 25 different podcasts, and they range in quality. So I'm not going to mention the bad ones because we're only going to focus on the good ones. Now, just because I haven't mentioned other podcasts doesn't mean to say they're the bad ones, by the way. So let's look at a few. So the first one is This Is Money. I mean, people know who This Is Money is, I'm sure. But they do a podcast and it's hosted by Georgie Frost and the editor of This Is Money, Simon Lambert. And to be honest, it's a decent podcast. They go into depth in a lot of different subjects. Every episode seems to cover a different subject in depth. They get guests on the show. It's a nice conversational style. I kind of liken their podcast to like an audio version of The One Show. They'll get a few people in, they'll talk things over, analogy. Chew the fat.
I like Georgie as well, in fairness, because I've met Georgie in real life a number of times, and she's a lovely person. And I always remember that, given that she works in radio, so she does the podcast, but she also works on talk radio. She's done a number of other different radio shows. She's got a brilliant voice for radio. And she came up to us at an event, or came up to me a number of years ago, probably about 3 or 4 years ago at an event, and said, "Oh, you're Damien." I'd never met her. And then just banged on about how much she liked the Money to the Masses podcast, how she thought it was brilliant, it's refreshing, all these really complimentary things, which was fantastic. She didn't have to do that, and that is nice to hear from somebody who is in broadcasting saying about how good they thought our podcast was or is. So, and I've listened to a lot of the stuff she does, and it's well worth listening to. She does do sports stuff as well, which is interesting. So anyway.
It really is a brilliant podcast. She's a great host, as you say. It's well produced, lovely conversational style, good mix of topics as well. And interestingly, they've just started producing sort of special podcasts. There's one series of podcasts called Making the Money Work, and that's actually hosted by Simon Lambert, the editor of This Is Money, but also with Andy Peters. Do you remember him from way back when?
Is he still going, Andy Peters?
He is, and he's a co-host on that podcast. So it was good to hear a voice from my childhood.
But that's the sort of person Andy loves. It brings out almost the red coat type person, entertainer in Andy.
Moving on to the next one, In Her Financial Shoes. Now that's hosted by Catherine Morgan. She's the founder of the Money Panel. She champions everything sort of finance, and she's a big champion of women in finance and educating people. She kind of has more of an investment focus, and she says that her podcast helps you learn the small behavioural and practical steps towards being financially resilient. So she's really passionate about helping, like I say, women in finance around investing, and she talks a lot about tools and courses and workshops that she's personally set up and run.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say this after every podcast you read out, but I've met Catherine. No, I met Catherine at a similar event, and only in the last 6 months, I think it was, because she does a lot of kind of money blogging things. And I went to an event, and she was there, and she came up to me, and we were talking. And she's a lovely person. She's got a really good backstory to her life as a person, which she does share on her social media platforms. But she's also a qualified financial advisor, which is unusual in itself. There aren't many people out there who do podcasts who are financial advisors, but particularly females. And she obviously has a thing for helping women. But the one thing she does also like is the whole psychology of money and thinking about money in terms of your relationship with money. So it's a slightly different take on things. And I would definitely say if you're wanting a female specific slant to money and views and some empathy with situations that women find themselves in, then I think it's definitely worth a listen.
She's got a really great style. She talks a lot about building self-confidence. She talks about how to help teach children about money, how to get debt-free. There's loads of really good stuff. And although it is, we've mentioned a couple of times, they're female-focused, don't switch off if you're a guy. I listen to her podcast and I love them. So moving on, Cash Chats with Andy Webb. Now this is hosted by Andy Webb, who's featured on Channel 5 money programs. He's got his own website, Be Clever With Your Cash. He's kind of one of these coupon money saving. Andy will go out there and find all of the stuff that you need to find in order to save a load of money. It's not just sort of money saving stuff. There is lots of features that he does. He's got a really natural style, and he'll cover a massive range of money subjects. And he does include the latest deals of the week, which kind of does date the podcast a little bit, but he says that at the start of the podcast. This is limited time only. If you're listening to this week, get involved. Here's the best deals of the week.
Yeah, I'm nothing against that though. We do midweek markets, and yeah, we make this podcast evergreen, but there's nothing wrong with doing mini shows that are contemporary. So yeah, good.
Moving on to a good friend of the show. It's the Meaningful Money Podcast, hosted by Pete Matthew. Now, we've met Pete a few times. We've interviewed Pete on this very podcast. He's got a really popular podcast himself. And on Pete's podcast, he discusses and explains all aspects of personal finance in how he describes simple, everyday language. And he covers basically the full range. Pete himself is a financial advisor, and we'll talk about everything from pensions, investing, savings.
He's a nice guy as well, Pete. I mean, anyone who listens to this knows that Pete and I are friends, and I mean, I've got a lot of love for Pete. He's such a good guy that at any opportunity I will try and champion and push what Pete does. And I mean, I know he's the kind of guy who reciprocates that, but it's because of what he does is quality. He doesn't have to do this. He's not doing it to try and appear smart, make money, and that's what's great about it. He's been doing it for a long time as well. So the Meaningful Money podcast has been around, but before that he did video. So Pete is a fantastic guy. We do our podcast meetups with him, with Money to the Masses listeners and Meaningful Money listeners. So I know a lot of you do listen to both shows, and actually our Facebook groups, I know there are a number of you that are in our group and a number are in Pete. So it's just a natural fit if you listen to this podcast.
What I love about Pete is when you're listening to Pete, he's got a really good style. You feel like he's talking to you, but amazingly, when you meet Pete in real life, and a lot of our listeners have met Pete from the meetups, he's exactly that same person. He's personable. He's friendly. You just want to give the guy a hug because he genuinely is.
Pete
is
is huggable.
He is a huggable guy.
Pete does like hugging too, so it works.
It's an excellent production. Pacey show, covers loads of topics, including interviews, and he does something called 5 Minute Friday, which is kind of a roundup of all things money in 5 minutes. He puts a timer on the screen. You can watch it on video or download it on the podcast too. Right, moving on. Money 101. This is a fairly new podcast, certainly that I've come across. It's been promoted quite a lot in the iTunes store. It's a BBC Sounds production, and it's hosted and produced by B. Duncan, and she explains that it is her journey to financial literacy. And every podcast focuses on a different area of personal finance each week. So one week it might be debt, then it might be property, long-term saving, and she has guest contributors that come on each week. So it's a conversational show that covers all different areas of finance, and it's pretty cool, to be honest. I like that one. The Dave Ramsey Show is one. It's a really popular podcast. You'll likely see it in your feeds and may have swiped past it. It's incredibly popular. It's actually an American DJ. Now, don't switch off just because I've said American. It's actually quite interesting. A lot of the stuff they talk about is still relevant to us in the UK. He's a popular American radio show host. He's an author. He's a businessman. He's got a southern drawl, and it's a bit Marmite. You either love it or you hate it.
Would you say he's slightly abrasive?
Yeah, definitely.
Because people ring up, and I listened to his show recently, and because it's so popular, and I'm thinking, what's the real hoo-ha about the show? And I always like to listen to different things. And I listened to the Dave Ramsey Show, and it's what he does is occasionally he almost just cuts people off. Not quite being rude, but it's an interesting style, and he does a baby steps thing. I mean, I'm sorry, I've just cut across you there, Andy, but he does this university baby steps, which is there's baby step 1, baby step 2 he goes on about. I'm trying not to do a naff American accent, but where it's kind of like what we do in the UK when we talk about you need to budget, you need to have an emergency fund before you start doing things like invest, pay down your debts. It's like that, and he's kind of built a university type course idea around it. So it's interesting.
Just one word of warning: if you get into the Dave Ramsey Show, be careful, because he does produce 15 podcast episodes, 1 hour long episodes a week, because it's basically his radio show that's distilled down into lots of podcast episodes. So that's 15 hours a week of podcasting. So you might go down that rabbit hole and never return again. The FT News Briefing. Now, this is the last one I'm going to mention. This is a really cool podcast. It's 10 minutes long. It's one of those bite-sized podcasts that allows you to dip in and dip out. It's from the newsroom of the Financial Times, and they explain that it provides a rundown of the most important global business stories you need to know for the coming day. And that comes out every weekday morning, so it'll hit your pod feed once a day.
Good. Is that the lot?
That's the lot.
That's a lot to listen to. So well done on getting through that. We promised we'd finish on a message from Lucy on our Instagram regarding Avios points. I'm going to just read this out because brilliant, but it's got more insight than I can give you on this stuff. So Lucy says that she likes the podcast, which is obviously lovely to hear, but she said that she's got a great tip for turning your Avios points into, or increasing them. And she says she's a fan of the premium card, the BA premium card that we mentioned in the previous podcast. So she's saying the tip that she's got can turn, rather than have 1.5 points per pound, you can get 6, 7, maybe 8 points or more per pound. And the way you do this is via the BAE store, which she says is a hidden gem. We've looked at this actually, and it is a hidden gem. I've never heard of it. It works like a cashback site. So if you're, by that you mean like things like Quidco,
yeah, top cashback, those kind of things. Yeah,
but you load your cards. It doesn't have to be a BA card, but why not max out on your points as well by using a BA card when you use the e-store? And if you're going to make a purchase through the likes of John Lewis, ASOS, Booking.com, etc., if you go through the BA e-store site, you can claim loads of extra Avios points per pound, plus the points you get on your card anyway. And by doing this, she gets thousands of points a year. And she also mentions that it's worth pointing out that if you spend over 10,000 a year on the premium card or 20k on the free card that we mentioned, the BA card, you can get a companion voucher, meaning someone can travel for free. Tax is not included in the same class. So by using the BA e-store, it's just a way of using, like I said, a cashback site. Very clever idea. getting those extra points, and then you can turn it into flights if that's what you want to do. So thank you, Lucy, for sending that in. We appreciate it.
If you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's at moneytothemasses with number 2. Don't forget, we've got our YouTube channel. You can go over to there, watch our videos. Please do subscribe. We've got over 1,000 subscribers now, which is great.
And don't forget to join the Facebook group in particular.
So that's it. I think we're done, aren't we?
We are done for this week. So until next time.
Till next time.